expectation is that, it's your turn, right? See what kind of advice we can give these two on the influence of audit committee communications in management incentives and auditor judgment.
Our research question is quite simple, is that the auditing standards in 2013 requires that the outside auditors need to communicate with the audit committee. So our question is that are the outsiders' opinion, like the audit quality, influenced by the auditing committee? And since outside auditors also need to communicate with the management, so are they more influenced by the audit committee or are they more influenced by the management, since their incentives are different? The audit committee they are independent, like they are the board of directors, and they need to reduce the agency costs and the litigation costs, so they may be more conservative but the management, they have different incentives. They want to maximize their utility, and like if they have certain constraints on their compensation contract, or they may be more aggressive in the financial reporting. So what we are going to research on is the question that are the outsider auditors more influenced by the audit committee when the management incentive to be more aggressive in financial reporting than the lower incentive to be more aggressive in their financial reporting.
Okay, so the research question here is that are external auditors, right? Are external auditors more influenced by the audit committee versus the management of the company, right? So this particular question assumes that auditors are influenced by each. Okay? And so are you saying that they are influenced by each? Like, for instance, are you drawing on past research to say, past research says that audit committees influence auditors? You have to establish that first. You know what I mean? Because I think that it can be arguable, right? So obviously if there's research that states audit committees influence external auditors in this way, right? You have to establish that first. And then you have to kind of defend yourself a little bit, right? Because external auditors have to maintain some sort of independence. So what you're really going to have to do for this particular research question is rely on the negotiation literature and the pressure literature, right? Saying that external auditors have all sorts of exogenous pressures, right? They have time budgets, they have partner pressures, they have auditor-client relationships that they're trying to maintain, all that good stuff. And there's a rich history in that, right? But all that's just to establish that, yes, there is an influence that's been documented. You have to do that first before you can even compare the two, right? Because you can't say, okay, is one influence good versus one bad? Are they both bad? You have to say there is an influence before you can go into that. So your question is, which one influences them more, right?
Yes.
But there is no direction to that. You're not saying that. When you say influence it, are we talking about a good or bad designation?
Honestly, the question of the fact that with management incentives are whether higher or lower, and we want to test to what extent the auditors are affected by outside accounting audit committee recommendations. I think it's
okay.
somehow different from whether influenced by this part or that part.
Okay. And I think that I get that too. Because in your first paragraph, you do say, are outside auditors more influenced, right? And so it seems as though you're comparing that. But then the next question actually is, are outside auditors influenced by the committee and to what extent, right? And that's a different question. Because one of them, you have to establish there's an influence. But the second one, you are establishing there's an influence, and then you want to determine how they influence, right? Those are two different questions. So I think that probably the way that you built the study is more on what you said, the extent, right? So the outside influence are communication, and we'll talk about that in a second. So you guys understand what their research question is? All right. All right. Before we move on a little bit, if we were doing the Libby boxes, right? Just the top two. What would you put into this first one, right? Remember, these are IVs, these are DVs over here, right? And this is conceptual, so it's a higher level. Higher than I am tall, right? And then this one's how you actually plan on measuring operation. So if we were just saying, what is your research question? What are you using to measure what? What would you say?
I think the first one should be the interplay between communication and management systems.
Okay, so the interplay between the auditor and those two different things?
No, the communication and the management systems.
Okay. Okay.
Which part of the
We'll put up this committee. So I think as we go through the rest of what you're saying, we're going to change these particular boxes.
Yeah, that's the difference between
Committee interplay, or what'd you say again? I'm sorry. Committee.
interplay between communications and management systems.
So okay, management system. That's what I wanted. Communication and management incentives. All right. So we'll come back to that as we remember these things as we go through this particular. All right. So why do you think that this particular research question is important? Why would anyone want to know the outcome of this particular study? What's your paragraph number 2? Why do you think it's important?
Because you have this standard, like, somehow require the outside, the outers to communicate with our, like, they are actually more like management, more dominant in this communication. Like the audit committee doesn't play any role in this input to make the better financial reporting.
So I think the spirit of the standard number 16 is that the external auditors should have this communication, right? They should keep the audit committee informed, right? Because, don't quote me, but technically the audit committee, the board of directors are the ones who employ the auditors, right? Not management, not that lower level, right? Because that's how we maintain that air of independence. We're directly interacting with management, not the audit committee. And as such, that's why the auditors should keep the audit committees informed, right? So when we talk about why your particular research question is important, so what is the impact of this communication? Like, why do we want to know whether or not there could be some outside influences in this particular communication? So what effect does your particular question have on industry or auditors or audit committees or management, the audit quality? The reason we ask this in research is because if, you know what I mean, it's like in hard science, if we said, okay, we've got this really important question about, we want to know why grass is green, right? And when you go and present this particular idea to everybody else, they're like, so what? It's green. Like, who cares? We're gonna walk on it. It's not gonna change anything. You know what I mean? So you would have to like convince them or tell them what the contribution is. Why should we care that grass is green? Maybe because if it wasn't green or if it's about to turn purple, we would all suffocate and die. You never know. Like, but why is this particular audit question worth, researching?
Like-
Yes, I think why we're trying to find out is because that when management incentives are higher, that auditors are more likely to be influenced by management incentives, like to manipulate the account receivables, some entries that the report will be more aggressive, so which is more against what the audit committee will expect the report to be.
So what you're saying is particularly for this question, like there might be some undue influence that could affect audit quality, right? And we need to understand it, because if it's affecting audit quality, we don't know, it could be affecting how the reliability of the financial statements or the result of the audit. That makes a lot of sense. Do I have any questions? What I think that this particular study needs to do a better job of is establishing the link between management, audit committees, and the auditor, right? Because we know that, we're gonna erase this, pretend this didn't happen. So we got 3 different parties in this particular research study. I didn't write this much on the board when I was teaching last year. So we've got, and this is where I think you guys can chime in, right? Make sure I can write with this one. We've got the audit committee. Actually, I probably should have had Randy do this since he had that little like 3 thing going on. Because I think, right? We've got the auditor, and we've got management. All right. And what auditing standard number 16 says is that, let's see, auditing standard 16 says these people should communicate, right? That's what that dotted line is supposed to be, communication. All right, so in your particular study, are you trying to say, oh yeah, sorry. See, she's paying attention. Actually, I probably should just, that's what I'm thinking. Audit committee. Exactly. Management. All right. Yeah, that makes more sense. All right, so is your study asking about the effectiveness of this communication, or is your study asking about influences from here to here and here to here? Well, we've got different colors. We can get fancy with this. Ah, okay. So, so when we're talking about, because there's a couple of different things going on in that particular proposal, right? So, auditors in during the audit and before and after, but during the audit, these 2 parties are constantly communicating. Right? They have to. The auditor auditor needs access to information, whether it's access to a system or paper or whatever, and constantly the auditor is kind of, expressing their findings to management. It's kind of like an ongoing thing, right? This doesn't happen as frequently as this communication, right? This is why they had to come out with the standard to say, hey, make sure you're doing that, right? Communicating, because auditors interact with management on a daily basis during the audit. They don't interact with the audit committee on a daily basis, which is why they have this kind of air of independence, because that there's a separation, right? There's supposed to be a separation here, right? And not too much there. All right, so there is an extensive amount of literature that talks about this particular interaction. Does it talk about it the way that you're proposing? I don't know. I don't know it that well. So there could be a niche there. But there is, it's called auditor-client relationship, right? And there's been research that's found that auditors can be influenced by management, right? And there are different situations in which that could be problematic, right? Maybe if there's a prior history, like this auditor has been doing audits with this particular client for years, right? They've developed relationships with these people, right? Maybe they don't want to lose the business for the firm. Maybe there could be a whole bunch of different influences, right? So there is auditor-client negotiations and auditor-client relationship literature that kind of talks about this influence, right? There's not a lot that talks about this, right? This is kind of one of those areas that the AAA has been talking about. We don't really have that much information, which is why AIS number 5 came, when was it? This one? 2000? Yeah. Right? So 2012, right? A lot of the auditing standards came about when the PCOB was developed and, after SOX, but this came about like 10 years later, right? There needs to be more research done in that area. So, your particular study, I'm going to ask the same question because I forgot, I'm sorry. Are we trying to ask the situations in which auditors can make this communication more effective? And we're also asking, does one of these two communications influence one more than the other in a positive or negative way? That's a lot of questions. That's a lot of questions. If you were building a experiment, typically one of the most, you can build an experiment in such you're only manipulating one variable. Either it's A or it's B, right? Either it's high or it's low in one situation. Typically, I do 2 by 2 ANOVAs, which means there's 2 variables on 2 levels. You have group A, integrated audit versus not integrated audit, and group, and variable B would be high or low risk, right? That way you can do like an interaction and kind of get more. Anyway, this is not an experimental class. But what you don't want to do is ask too many questions at the same time, because this would be almost 2 different experiments. You see what I mean? Because one, here by itself, you could ask, okay, what factors influence whether or not this communication line is effective, right? Maybe there's a prior history, maybe the makeup of the audit committee, right, can be intimidating to the auditors, and so that communication is kind of persuaded in one way or the other. You know what I mean? So if the audit committee is made up of, I think there's guidance on how it should be made up, but this is hypothetical. If it's made up of, Fortune 500, CEOs, and then maybe one person who has familiarity with the industry, that may influence the way the auditors, that communication interacts. So you can explore that, right? And then you have to determine, what do you mean by effective communication? That's really key. What's effective versus what's not? So how do you measure that? Then you could go back and talk about what makes this line of communication effective versus not? You know what I mean? How can we improve it? You know, what can we do? Now, when you start trying to like compare the two, that's a whole nother can of worms, right? Because if you give one set of your subject pool this communication between the auditor and management, and give another one this, you can't compare the two. So you almost have to give the same auditor, like audit pool, a communication with management and a communication with the audit committee, right? And if you do that, there's certain experimental techniques you have to do to make sure that, well, did they get this information first and that one second? And this one first and that one second? You have to counterbalance it. Otherwise, you're not turning the right dial, which is why we try to avoid overly complicated. You can do it, but I think for you guys, one, defining what effective communication actually is extremely important no matter which way you go. Two, choose which question you're actually, there's a number of questions in your proposal. I think that you can make them separate experiments. And then use some of Randy's visualization techniques and see if you can. But do you have any questions about what you wanted to do? Oh, okay. That's another question, actually. So, if you're, here, let's draw it. Quarterly dollar boxes, right? And high management incentive. Actually, I should just wrote it like this. Management incentive is high. So here it would be audit committee. And you said it's yes or no?
Or no.
Which one? Huh? So either they have one or they don't? Okay. So yes, they have one. No, they don't.
Actually, we do the scale.
Oh, yeah, that's the DV. That doesn't go in here. So you would, the DV would be rate, likelihood of what? Of accepting, making adjustment. I'll pose this question to the class. If this was their experimental design, what would you think that their hypotheses would be? If I said that in this particular experiment, right, we got two IVs, they don't have it, so it's okay. Right? Either management has a high incentive to, let's say here, their compensation packages have a huge bonus for profitability, right? High earnings. Here, they have low, right? So either they have a high incentive to manage earnings or low one. I'm just making this up. And in certain situations, they either have, they have an audit committee and they don't have an audit committee, or is it if they have an effective? Okay. So in this situation, they have a very active audit committee, right? There's a lot of communication between the audit, right? We'll call that effective. That's how it works. And here, they have a very distant audit committee. They're not that active, That makes sense. I think I understand this one, right? So what would your predictions be? And remember, you're rating the auditor's likelihood to make an adjustment. So really, that's a proxy for how influenced they are by a particular combination of events. I don't want to influence the hypothesis. What do you think? of likelihood for an adjustment? Which one in which the,
4.
so I heard 3, I heard 2, anybody for 4?
Yeah.
4, all right? Here's why we don't, obviously it's a one-off question, but here's why we don't understand which one, right, would be the highest. It's because we don't know the effect, right, the theorized effect of the audit committee's interaction with the audit, right, in terms of making an adjustment. Research would say that if there is a lot of, management has an incentive to manage earnings, it's high, that means the likelihood of making the adjustment, barring auditor's influence, like not in this particular study, but barring auditor's influence, is going to be low, right? That means they're going to fight more, right? We have a high incentive to keep it the way it is. Auditors are going to propose adjustments, we're going to be like, no, so they're going to fight a little bit more. Now, if separately, if the audit committee has is very active, right? Typically, can't remember the research, so don't quote me, but typically they're going to side with the auditor, right? Right? So if the audit committee is extremely active, that means the rate of the likelihood of making an adjustment is high, right? That's right. So then you kind of deal with the interaction between the two. I think that if this is your particular design, that your question needs to change just a little bit. And I think that's why I was saying it's 2 different experiments, because I didn't really understand how you were trying to connect it together. So really you should define not communication effectiveness, but audit committee involvement, right? So it's how connected are they to the audit? Are they involved or are they distant? And there is research on that, right? Because Helen and I were talking, and what we didn't understand is, what do you mean by effective communication? How do you measure whether or not the communication is effective? Is it what we say, or is it how often we talk? Like, what makes it effective or not? But that's not even necessarily what you're getting at. What you're getting at is how involved they are with the audit, right? So not even necessarily the relationship with the auditor, it's just the audit itself. Are they involved or are they not, right? Because they do wield some sort of influence. And then here, you have to define what management incentive is. Are we talking about to manipulate earnings? Are we talking about to side with the auditor? Like, we definitely have to define specifically what you mean by incentive. Because I think I know what you mean, but I'm just guessing. But I like it. But I would have to be careful, because there is research on this. How likely an auditor, the likelihood of auditors, the management accepting a proposed adjustment, right? Because it's really not the auditor making the adjustment. They propose the adjustments. Management has to make it, right? So back to audit committee communication, like I said, I don't think that was the variable we were talking about. Committee involvement, maybe, or activity or interaction. Well, I would say involvement. And then management incentives, we have to kind of say what that actually is. But I like it. Do you guys have any more questions? No? You can. The floor is yours if you want it. Okay. All right. Last but not least, we've got Andrea and Edward. Fortunately for you guys, it's the one I drew the most on, so sorry.
So I'm gonna try to draw something here.
No, who's speaking next week? Oh, Glenn Schaefer. I saw that on the schedule, but I'm not exactly sure what he's going to be talking about. So you want to hear that? Yeah, that one. I think he'll talk a lot, so you won't have to do that.
Last year it was scheduled for 2 weeks. Now it's been 1 week.
Oh, okay. Whenever you're ready, we're all yours.
Okay, so our research question seeks to understand the communication effectiveness between external audit and internal audit. And the background for that is that the PCAOB recommends the auditor to use the work of internal audit for performing test of controls, performing substantive procedures, and also understanding internal control. But the standards do not provide a clear guidance on how external auditors should assess the work of internal audit. And assessing the work of internal audit as competent and objective should motivate external auditors to use the work of internal audit or rely on the work of internal audit. So
I had a question, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
So, the reason the PCOB recommends that auditors use, or I said allows, but allows the external auditors to use the work of internal auditors is because, you know, auditors do risk-based assurance, right? Audits. So that means that there's only a limited amount of resources and time, right? And so you want to concentrate where the highest risks are. And by leveraging the work of internal auditors, you can really get an inside track on where that is, right? There is valuable information there. So that's why they say that. However, I'm curious as to why you guys said that, you know, then the PCOB does say, give some guidelines. It says that, you know, the external auditors need to determine whether or not the internal auditors are competent, right? And whether or not they're objective. And objectivity is defined not as independence, but as who they report to. Like, do they report to management, or do they report to the audit committee or the board of directors, which is said, if they report to the board of directors, then they are objective, right? There's a removal of reporting directly to the management, which as an internal auditor, that's what you did. You reported to the higher ups. You didn't report to the management. However, I'm curious as to why you guys said that that information, including what the internal auditors actually did, I forgot that part, why that should motivate external auditors. What is that? I mean, it could be semantics, but I'm just wondering why you say it should motivate the auditor.
Well, the way that we thought about it, and also from my experience, like a lot of the times we had access to a work of internal audit, but we never used it because it wasn't enough, you know, for PCAOB standards. And we also were not sure if internal audit was really competent or objective.
And it's kind of weird in the standards too, right? Because it's like, you can use it, but you still have to kind of test it, right?
Yeah,
So it's like, you're almost like doing double work. Why do I even use it then if I have to test it? So there's this gray area. But I don't know if I would say motivate the external auditors, just because the internal auditors are competent and objective, that doesn't mean that the auditors should, you know, rely on the work. It's kind of a weird thing to say. Like, I get what you're saying, but I don't know if I would use the word motivate. I would say maybe encourage.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
that's what it's just weird to say motivate, because it's like, almost like,
Go do it.
yeah, right? I don't know. That tripped me up, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're right. But what we were trying to get at is, you know, if they think the work of internal audit is of high quality because, you know, they're objective and they're competent and they know what they're doing, then external auditors are going to be more motivated to use that work. Well, again, I said motivated.
Yeah, but they should be.
Yeah.
That should be enough for them to say, okay, we should use it.
Right, so we would like to use their reliance on the work of internal audit as a proxy for the effective
experiment, we will control three kind of information type. The first one is just a framework, it's like a diagram. And the second one is a diagram plus some explanation. So after we show these materials for the external auditors, we will ask them to perceive them, or what kind of information you think is more reliable. We will set up a Likert scale, like a 1, 2, 3, 7, like the doctor's office, their pain scale, and they will show us what the scale is. Yeah, it's 7 or it's just 1, something like that.
Yeah. I think I have to think about that a little bit more, because I don't know if that's actually capturing reliance, because once you, I guess we'll talk about it in a second when we talk about those 3 levels, but I almost feel like it'd be hard to use a Likert scale to capture that once you've given it to them, because maybe they're just reporting that they rely on it.
But yeah,
Yeah, you know what I mean? So it's self-reported.
that's a problem.
Yeah. So I don't know. We'll get to it when we talk about the, because maybe there's a different way we can tweak that particular variable. My second question was, so I understand that reliance on the work of the internal auditor is a proxy for effective communication, but I don't know, how do you define effective communication? What's effective versus what's not? Even though you're using the proxy for it, you still have to what is it?
Would you like to use the perceived value to catch the effectiveness and the reliableness?
Okay.
So, but yeah, generally there is some problems in this process, but it's experiment. We only assume the external auditors will give us the information what they actually think.
Yeah. So that sometimes there may be a way to capture it without asking them. You know what I mean? Instead of self-reporting. And again, it's going to take some thought, but I know that was a question that Helen had, that when we talked about it, defining effective communication is going to be tricky. Because, of course, you can rely on previous research. Like, if you can find a study that measured effective communication and use their proxies, then you're good. But if you can't find one, then you're like, okay, how do I justify this being what we define as effective communication? And based on that definition, then yes, reliance on the work of the internal auditor is a proxy for it. Because as it stands, you're going to have a hard time convincing any reviewer that reliance on the work of the internal auditor is a proxy for effective communication. And maybe it's not. Maybe it's a reliance on the work is a good proxy for another variable, when we just haven't identified what that variable is yet. It could not be effective communication. And I think that's what Helen and I were talking about earlier, that it's not necessarily a communication effectiveness that you're capturing. It could be something completely different.
By the way, in this process, could the reliability test can help to relieve this problem?
You were definitely, I hate to use the word, but there are a lot of variables you can use to determine fit, right?
Yeah.
Or determine the actual construct that you're trying to capture. So yeah, you can measure whether or not that's what you're getting at. And there's going to be research to help you support. I had this problem with my dissertation as well, because I thought I was capturing accountability. And maybe that's what I thought I was, but actually it was more of a variable, a construct called process focus that I was really getting at, And to me, as a non-EFA, CFA person, I'm like, it's semantics. Just pick another word and go with it. But there's ways that you can get that. And there are definitely reliability measures that you can do to determine whether or not that's what you're getting. Just something to consider. The terms may change, but the point will still remain the same.
why it's important. It's about how external auditor assess the ultimately relies on the work of internal auditor. Because the PCLB want to recommend their external auditor to use the work of internal auditor is because internal auditor is the expertise, expert to understand this form specifically better than external auditor. And it's useful to use that. So how do external auditor assess the work of internal auditor as competent and objective is a question. And intuitively, the more concise information provided, the more external auditor should be inclined to rely on the work of internal auditor. But psychological literature show inconsistency observations results. And also, according to Clark and Marshall 1981 work, they say information overlapped can help disclosure understanding. So based on this theoretical basis, we would like to understanding the circumstances of when external auditor relies on the work of internal auditor can help auditors get more efficiency and perform a higher quality audit. This study aims to shed light about the dynamic that influence the reliance on the work of internal audit.
I got a question about this because really it's that last bullet point that gets to the why this is important, right? The other things are kind of like facts about it, but really why does it matter, right? Because it matters because understanding the circumstances of when an external audit relies on the work of internal audit can help auditors gain more efficiencies and perform higher quality audits, right? So that's why it's important. But the problem I have with this is that, yes, that's extremely important, but that's not what this study measures. What this study actually captures is that last sentence, right? It sheds light on the dynamics that influence the reliance of the work, right? Yeah. It doesn't necessarily help us understand how auditors gain more efficiency. So it seems like they're connected and they should be, like intuitively, yeah, of course. But when you're talking about your specific contribution, you want to be careful, right? Because if you say that this study does this in your particular paper as you're building up the contribution, and it doesn't, reviewers are going to be like, okay, no. You did none of this. You said you were doing it, and it could be one sentence and buried in like the first 3 pages, and they're like, no, that's not what this does. So, yes, that's important. But by putting it there, it almost implies that that's what your study's about. You know what I mean? If your study specifically is on whether or not the type of information impacts the reliance on, the internal auditor's work, right? And you can connect those two. I would think of more of a concise way to say that exact same thing in that bullet point. There's nothing wrong with it. I just think it just a little bit better. But notice I didn't say communication effectiveness. Just putting that out there.
That was a question that like we met to talk about the proposal, and we kind of went back and forth because we would like to measure communication effectiveness, but we didn't really know how to. And
in and of itself, if you're talking about whether or not the internal and the external auditors communicate effectively, that's just an issue by itself. So we communicate very well. You're internal audit, I'm external audit. We have a very good rapport. You know what I mean? So that doesn't mean you're giving me the information that I need, or does it? Like, that's what you have to establish. What do you mean by effective communication? Once you do that, then maybe you could be capturing that. But you have to be very specific about
what can.
Yeah, what do you mean? Because as an internal or external audit, Like, if you're telling me communication is, you have an open door policy, so if I have a question about control policies or procedures, I can go to Edward or Andrea any day and go, maybe that's communication effectiveness.
But my experience is, if somebody do this, suppose I am a manager,
Mhm.
I provide some relevant information to you, and the communication is not effective because what you get is always, I doubt this, and I don't believe you this information. And
So it's about the quality of the information
Yeah.
exchanged between the two.
that's true.
So maybe that's something different, like, because now you're saying that I want to, the information flow between each other, like, if I'm drawing relevant information that's useful for the audit, right? Is that a more effective communication than if you give me irrelevant information? Then you have to define what's relevant and what's not, because it could be situational. And I'll give you a small quick, even though this was an internal audit that I was on. I was auditing a distribution center, right? And at the end of every day, I would go to the management of the distribution center and just tell them about the audit that we had, right? And we're communicating, and that's great, right? And I'm like, do you have information about the cycle that we're going to be doing tomorrow? And they're like, yes. You can get it from Betsy. She's got the information. But while we're having this little disclosure, he mentions that the police will be stopping by. Okay. This is a real story, so I'm not gonna lie. And I'm like, okay, cool. Let's why?
Right.
They're like, oh, well, a couple of months ago, we had a couple of semis stolen off the lot. I say, what? They're like, yeah. And I'm like, were they full? They were like, yeah, they were full of products, but okay, that wasn't necessarily relevant to anything that I was going to do, but that information definitely changed the course of the audit, because now we have all sorts of like control violations that I was not aware of. It would have not necessarily been captured in my normal course of work. I would say that communication was awfully effective, but at that precipice, like, was that information relevant? Yes? No? It wasn't expected, so maybe it's relevant. It's useful, right? So I don't know if I still am not convinced it's effective communication. I think it's relevant information, right?
It should be carefully to define. Yeah.
Because again, I had the whole problem with the accountability, and I knew what I was trying to say, but that was not the word that I should have been saying.
Yeah.
That's all. But and I think that you're on to something, and sometimes it's not until you start to get into it that you're like, okay, we keep calling it transference of information. Why don't we call it that? You know?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, think about it.
Okay, then for the last kidney question, what we're going to do about it, we like to do an experiment with the 3-factor design, and we're going to test how external auditors examine different types of information provided from internal audit. And this is where we mentioned it, the different levels of information. So at the less detailed level, we have the 1-page internal control matrix with the outcomes of the internal control test. And at the medium level, we have the matrix and also a 2-page detailed explanation. At the last level, we have the same amount of detail, but we also add a historical trend.
Okay. So here's my thoughts about this. You're saying that the 3-factor design is different types of information, right? 1, 2, 3. Technically, it's not.
I know what you mean. Yeah. Actually, it's 3 factors. I mean, the 3 is determined. But here, maybe it's high, it's low. Maybe it's for our externality, this is for measurement.
Well, it would be better, because those are almost two different variables on the left side. You could basically say it's a high-low risk situation.
Yep.
Where in one situation there's a lot of internal control problems in the matrix, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's high risk, the other one's low. That's not the part that I was like, that's not the type. Because the problem, it's not a problem actually. You're not giving the subject different types of information, you're giving them more information, right?
Yeah.
So if it was different, no one group would have the same information. You're giving each group progressively more information.
But the problem is sometimes the manager, the internal auditors, if they want to commit a strategic fraud, they will give you more information to mislead you.
Yes, and that's called the dilution effect. But that's still not what this variable is. They are giving, you even said it in one of the pages. Oh, on question 2 where you're like, more detailed information provided more to the external auditors. You're giving more information. So if I'm saying it's different types of information, that means no one group is getting the same thing. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
If it's different types. So it's saying that one group's gonna get an internal control matrix, one group's gonna get just the outcomes,
Yep.
not the actual matrix, another one's getting a 2-page explanation, and those are 3 different types. Versus one group gets A versus the other group gets A and B versus, because you're progressively giving them more information,
Mm-hmm.
it's not different types, it's a different amount of information, right? You're revealing more information to the other. Now, like you said, it could be seeded that the information's irrelevant. That's a different study though. That's not necessarily here.
So how about the matrix and visualization?
That's different types. That's different types. All I'm saying here is that you can't call it different types. You can say more.
Okay.
Because different types implies that no one group gets the same information.
Yep.
It has to, now, different types can be different forms of information. Like you can give them only a matrix, you can give them only the results, or only some sort of visualization, you know. That's true. But you just have to change the word. Because
Okay.
it's not types
Okay.
if they're getting the same thing.
Yep.
And if you want to make it a 3x2 or 2x3 factorial design, you can add high-low.
Yeah, it's
Or-
very actually
It can get complex, and you have to get more subjects if you do it that way.
the interaction is too complicated for 3x3 or 2x3. It's
It
very
can get-
complicated.
But you can do it. Yeah, I remember saying I would never do it, but it's possible if it's compelling. Now, what you could do is just take out one of the information, like make it 2x2. You can still
Yeah.
do high-low, and then do
Yeah.
this one versus this one, or you can split it up into 2 different experiments and say, okay, here's the traditional one, right? How does it compare against the matrix plus the outcomes? Here's the traditional one with just the matrix. How does it compare to matrix plus the third one? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to build upon it. Like you said, more, it doesn't have to be more, right? You can just separate it out.
Okay.
Then take away that complicated interaction term.
Yeah. So for the 5 bucks framework, the concept is different types of information. We have lead different perception value, and operationally intercontrol of test results is for the different types of information. And the perception value is about the
What is perception value again?
actually, here is not very suitable. I should say it's the dependent value.
It would be the reliance.
Oh, so it's
Effectiveness and reliance.
so so is it rely or don't rely, or is it the like a Likert scale where it's like likelihood to rely.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about the perceived value part, but go on, sorry.
Actually, it's from economics something.
Right, trying to
Yeah.
fit that in.
So it's not very suitable. Yeah, I'm thinking about that.
Yeah.
And control is some demographics.
Which you can absolutely capture, and you should always, in your experiments, have some sort of kind of debrief page where I didn't necessarily capture the age of my participants, but I did capture their audit age in a sense, like how long have you been an auditor, how many engagements have you performed internal controls, how long have you been a senior in months, that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Because, like you said, it could be some sort of, either you can control for it, or you never know, it could be a covariate, right?
Okay.
It could be causing, all sorts of good stuff. Yeah, my last note was, again, I don't think it's type, I think it's the amount of information given, Like, so you think about it, if you have all this internal control information, and you're like, okay, if I want to reduce the amount, let me take away this piece. If I want to reduce the amount, let me take away. That's exactly what you guys did in reverse, right? So it is amount to me. I'm just going to keep on saying that. That was it that I had for this. I think Helen wanted me to make sure that you check to make sure there isn't research specifically about this, right? That it's because there is definitely research about internal control, internal auditors and external auditors and using their information. But what we said was that it wasn't specifically about it was about the outcome,
Yeah.
whether or not they chose to use it,
Yeah.
not whether or not it, certain influences affect the internal or external auditor's choice to use it or not.
Yeah.
It's like, did they? Well, now, did they or didn't they rely on it? Versus, okay, what could possibly affect the reason that they chose to or not, right? Because they're allowed to. And you guys said that the PCOB recommends it, so why wouldn't they?
Yeah.
And so now you're just exploring why they wouldn't. So, of course, whenever you do research, you want to exploit that,
Exactly.
right? This is like, hey, this is why this is so novel and important. All the reviewers used to tell us whenever we go into like different seminars is that it's the contribution that sells the research, right? So you really have to spend the most time on that second paragraph, even though it seems like the easiest or like a throwaway, but it's really what sells your research. If you can make a compelling story, it's going to change the journals that you target. Right? It could be the same type of research. I've seen my research in other places. Of course, it was just what I was thinking of, not what I actually did. And I'm like, oh, I guess I could have framed it like that in my head, and it would have been, a TAR versus a AOS or something.
Do you think it's a realistic research?
Yeah. But I'm biased, I'm a behavioralist, so I think that anything that explores the nature of why we make decisions, of course I think it's about whether or not, again, you're exploring, so why do I even care, right? I don't know if you guys read that in your seminars, the David Wetton's 7, what is the research, why is it important, who cares, that kind of thing. You have to think about that. Who's your audience? Who is this research going to impact? Why is it important? Like I said, if you're telling me that auditors drive to work every day, and that impacts their frame of mind versus the ones that bike, and you're like, okay, I don't see why this is relevant to anything in the world. Like, okay, so yes, that's true. Who cares? Like, you have to think about the impact of what you're saying and what it means. So if you find out that there's certain factors that influence whether or not auditors make different decisions to rely on information, well, knowing that fact can change the way that maybe firms instruct their auditors to obtain information.
That's what
or to interact with the internal auditors. Maybe they're like, hey, we could be more efficient, to steal one of Randy's terms, to be more efficient in our audits if we were able to encourage our auditors to use this information, right? Maybe there's a bias we can overcome by doing this. But again, it's just about selling it. Me telling you this doesn't change your research, it just sells it better, right? That's all. That is it. Thank you
Thank
guys
you.
for the presentation.